If you slash the regulators, then you can't fight the fraud that Elon Musk is supposedly trying to counter. And that's exactly what he's done. And that tells you he's not trying to prevent fraud, he's trying to incentivize it.
Mic check, everyone. My name's Eric, and welcome back to Corruption Inc. So today, what I want to talk about is who does corruption target? And so when you think about it, corruption has two primary targets. One would be your competition. If you're better at being involved in corrupt practices, chances are you're going to get a leg up against the competition. You're going to gain more money, more power. You win. Now, how do you do that? Well, that's where target number two comes in. Target number two are your ability as a corrupt CEO, a corrupt individual, corrupt person in an organization to exploit the people with whom you have power over. And so this obviously creates toxic environments and creates for a corrosive agent within our society. And we have seen this time and again in the private sector. In fact, these are often the precursors to things that lead to financial crises, for sure. I mean, when we think about 2008 and our work in the CON, one of the things that we saw is that the ability of these non-bank lenders to go and fraudulently sell mortgages to unsuspecting people was by hiring people and exploiting their naivete in order to get them to do things that were illegal and allowed them to sell products to people that they should never have sold products to. And that started all the way on the loan broker level, but went all the way through to the highest ends of Wall Street. And of course, we understand what that led to, and that we're still wallowing in the midst of the aftermath of. But there's a lot of signs to indicate that these same things are riddling the public sector as well, especially now. So in order to better understand this, I talked to Professor June Carbone. She, along with Naomi Kahn and Nancy Levitt, wrote Fair Shake, Women in the Fight to Build a Just Economy. And reading this book was fascinating because a lot of the lessons that are to be learned from this don't necessarily just apply to women. Women often feel the effects of what's described in here first and heaviest, but ultimately it's a monster that comes for us all, to quote a recent television show. But anyway, it was a magnificent conversation, and I'm sure that you're going to learn as much as I did from it. So everybody, June Carbone. All right, so we're here with Professor June Carbone of the University of Minnesota. She is the holder of the Robina Chair in Law, Science, and Technology. And she is also the co-author of Fair Shake, Women and the Fight to Build a Just Economy, along with Professors Naomi Kahn and Nancy Levitt. And so, June, how are you doing?
All right. Recovering from the fact we had snow this week
Well,
after
yeah,
being 70 last week.
I think that's called spring in the Midwest. So, all right, well, great. So, interesting today. Just happens to be a completely no news, economically speaking day. Nothing happening at all, So, so it's a good thing that we're talking about some of these stuff. So yeah, I know that we have like a bunch of stuff that we want to talk about, but I mean, I feel like given sort of like, what's kind of currently happening, I think we have to mention, that the effects of the tariffs coming in place and what have you. And just before we jump into the rest of this, I just want to know if you had like any kind of a quick take on that.
Well, in one of the interviews I gave, I said the only thing that can save the United States is having Trump utterly crash and burn. and that a global depression, which is what I'm predicting, is one way of finally discrediting MAGA. And the interviewers said to me, that's the most optimistic thing I've heard in all the interviews I've done. And
Well, all right.
and I went on to quote Piketty, who talked about that the lead up to that comment was that in many ways this resembles the Gilded Age. And they are prior era where we have a new economy, where the new economy blows through all the guardrails, where the oligarchs are in charge, where there are recurrent recessions, the oppression of the working class, corruption of government. And it took last time two world wars and the Great Depression to put a stake through the heart of the oligarchs. And this time, I'm hoping it will just be global depression.
Right, right. Yeah. So global depression, no more, please. No, no. Well, it's interesting you brought up Piketty because I mean I really feel that that is, from my perspective, I feel is a very apropos because when I think of what I've read of his, it's like he talks about how we came out of this period of time when wealth was basically described as the amount of property you own, right? And
Hmm.
so I think that as things have turned over the last 50 years, that we're seeing that even though we might not have like an aristocracy, based off of, you know, based off of whatever, like it feels as though that we're kind of heading back towards that because as everything's becoming more and more expensive and the economies are blowing up and so on and so forth, that wealth gap is increasing to such a degree that it is very much becoming a situation, fastly moving to a situation to where it's like it is going to be property owners and everybody else. And so
Oh,
yeah.
I think we're there. And we're there in terms of levels of inequality. And we're very close to there in terms of oligarchic power
Mhm.
overshadowing everything else. I have a lovely picture that I often use when I give talks on this, and it's a picture of a large school of fish. Now, it's not, a big fish. It is a school of fish
Mhm.
in the shape of a large fish,
Right.
swallowing the little fish. And I use that slide to say that a lot of what has taken place, and the reason this era is so different from, say, industrialization in 1910 or 1929, is that the old capitalists built things. They had factories. They needed workers. The grand bargain in the middle of the 20th century is uh, the capitalists got to keep their wealth. The oligarchs effectively kept their cartels, steel, auto, etc. And the workers got a raise. And Johnny Kenneth Galbraith, who has been denounced by many economists as saying that he's brilliant at describing the era that has just passed, talked about countervailing powers and the grand peace. But the grand peace at the middle of the 20th century, the key factor is 90% marginal tax rates put in place during World War II, and they stayed in place, very high marginal tax rates into the 60s. It's Kennedy who first began to lower them in 1963. And of course,
Right.
Reagan took a sledgehammer. But those high marginal tax rates set up win-win deals. The unions of the 50s, what they really wanted was job security.
Right, right. I mean, security isn't that's kind of like a basic human, need and desire. And one thing that I always that's always interesting, or that I want to make sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of people often have like a misconception when they hear 90% marginal tax rates. Like they're thinking that 90% off of everything. So if you make $100 and you're in that 90th percent rate, that you're only walking away with 10. that's only for the amount of money beyond that tax bracket.
Right.
So like if you're only so like if so like your first $11,000 is being taxed the same way as a person who's only making $11,000, and your next $32,000 is only being taxed the same way that somebody's being taxed $32,000. And so it's only like that very top where it's like you're at the highest of the high, in income, that tax rate, but the rest of your money below that is being taxed at lower rates. So I just think that it's an important thing to throw out there, just because I think that there's a lot of misconceptions when people hear 90% marginal tax rate.
Nicely explained. But one of the things that comes out of that, but whether you talk about tax rates or you just talk about inequality, is how much it skews everything else. So I like to say what was different about, and it's not really the 50s, it's the entire era from 1940 really until the age of Reagan.
Mhm.
And the big difference, and I like to explain it this way, compare George Romney, the father, who had been the head of American Motors and governor of Michigan and ran for president, with Mitt Romney, the son, who's the head of Bain Capital, a hedge fund or a private equity fund, and governor of Massachusetts, who runs for president. In George Romney's era, and both Romneys ran for
Right.
president, touting their success as businessmen, as opposed to governors. In for George Romney, the mark of his success as a businessman is the health of American motors. For Mitt Romney, nobody really cares about the health of Bain Capital, a vulture capital fund. Uh,
Right.
and I'm not even sure Mitt really cared. It's an extraction device. With the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal saying Mitt's bragging rights are the 200 million he has in the Cayman Islands. But if he were really a good businessman, he'd have more than 200 million in the Cayman Islands. In other words, it's the size of one's personal fortune, not the health of the company that matters.
Right. So, I mean, does that seems to me that would, given the eras, that would very much track with sort of the way that executive compensation has changed from one era to the other. And so, in with the way that executive compensation has changed and how incentives have changed, that seems like it's just a logical, sort of, outcome, from that. I was wondering if you could kind of explain, that transition.
Sure. Well, that's what, in a way, that's what our book is about. So we set out to write a book about women. In the beginning, at least some of my co-authors thought of it as the scorecard. That is, how are women doing? They're losing here, there, and everywhere. And I was in the background saying, but women aren't the biggest losers. Blue-collar men are in terms of certain measures. Um, and we started to look, and we wanted a broad cross swath. This is a book, Simon and Schuster, for average people, so we have lots of good stories. And we were stunned to find that every story was the same story. So when you go into the idea of executive compensation, what we found in every publicly traded company and most private equity and hedge funds, what matters is how is the share price in a publicly traded company doing this quarter? Now, the poster child, the epitome of this is Jack Welch. Jack Welch is the legendary CEO of GE. He becomes CEO in 1980 and stays for 20 years. He becomes CEO during the last era of stagflation, and with a mandate to really supercharge things. What does he do? First thing he does is to fire about 25% of the workforce. Unheard of in big corporate America at that era.
Right.
And then he adopts a new system of compensation. He hated the term rank and yank. That's what everybody else called it. But it is, you want to align executive incentives with share price. So you do that by awarding a bigger percentage of compensation in the form of stock options. Share price goes up, your compensation goes up. He then pits everybody against each other. rank and yank. It is grading on a curve. The top 20% or so are being groomed for promotion. The bottom 10% will be fired every year.
Right.
And you keep culling. And the advantage of this kind of system, it does a lot of things. Welch called it differentiation. That is, you don't treat employees as equal. You treat them as on a ladder. And you pit them against each other. But the huge advantage is you're signaling whatever it is, the bonus rewards, you will get more of it. And you will get more of it without having to tell people what to do. So, what did Jack Welch really want? What made his reputation is over a 20-year period, earnings beat reported expectations, reported earnings beat expectations almost every quarter. And while GE reported earnings went up several 100%, more than 300% during this 20-year period, share price went up over 4,000%. And
Huh.
so if you manipulate earnings, and of course you're giving bonuses based on the earnings, then your reported earnings beat expectations, share price goes up, and you look golden.
Right, right. So every time I hear, rank and yank, and think about it, it always brings me back to that scene in Glengarry Glen Ross, where in the movie anyway, Alec Baldwin is like saying, this month's incentive program, it's like, first place gets a Cadillac Eldorado, second place a set of steak knives, third place you're fired.
Yeah,
It's
that's and this spread over 50% of publicly traded companies had adopted rank and yank by the year 2000, the year Jack Welch retires as head of GE. It is also closely associated with the Enron disaster, Enron, WorldCom, and the frauds. So
right,
after that, companies don't adopt it too loudly. But what they get rid of is the yank part. The incentive pay, 96% of publicly traded companies have some form of incentive pay. Now, I'm in a system with incentive pay, but in the academy, it's pretty minimal, so it's not a big deal. But in much of corporate America, it can be as much as two-thirds of total pay. And yeah, a big chunk. And they haven't gotten rid of it. Elon Musk uses it at his companies today, and the rest is Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley is in the middle of a depression. We had a venture capital boomed during the era of low interest rates during the first Trump administration. After COVID, we had a Silicon Valley venture capital crash.
mhm,
78% of startups failed. I think it was in 2023. And the big companies had to cull. And what did they do? They used rank and yank to cull.
right, right. So, well, so one of the interesting things about because rank and yank seems that it's almost necessary for the kind of corporate fraud that we see, on a large scale. Like I recall in our documentary series, The Con, we spoke with a trainer. His name escapes me. He was a person who was formerly some sort of a person with the World Wrestling, and he was talking about he was talking about that, how it's like, basically the top people would become wildly rich based on the incentive structures, and everybody else would just fall aside, and that they kept on, and that by encouraging that, not necessarily having to worry about the people at the bottom, but obviously showing that if you do whatever it takes to get to your goal, then you are going to be rewarded greatly. Now that could be fancy cars, it could be, like all sorts of different things. And then the other people just fell by the wayside. And that eventually, the way he put it, it says that you do this long enough, you're going to have that team of sharks that you're looking for.
That's
And that always stuck with me as being like, okay, that is obviously the most toxic form of rank and yank. And it also feels inevitable. if you're instituting that at some point.
Yes. And that's what we found in every institution we looked at. So, we looked for sex discrimination cases. I mean, this is a book about women. And we started out with Betty Dukes at Walmart. And
Yeah, great
Walmart
story.
was the largest class action in American history. And the first draft we had was, could be written by law professors, that Betty Dukes, in fact, the first draft said, Betty Dukes, she had 20 years experience in retail. She was a no-brainer for management. Then she hit the glass ceiling. They kept passing her over. There were no criteria. They hired people through a tap on the shoulder. Sexism. And I took a look at it and, informed by a lot of my husband, Bill Black's understanding how these things worked, and said, don't you understand what's really going on here? And I started digging. And, the nice thing about Walmart and the largest class action in US history is that there's a ton of data. And it turns out what Sam Walton was doing from the beginning is a system of wage theft. So when you tell this, I love to talk about Walmart as the once and future sexism because it begins, Walton starts in Arkansas in 1948. And Arkansas is emerging from, World War II and the Great Depression. Agriculture is mechanizing. Women have time on their hands. And he discovers here's a really cheap labor source. He opens his first Walmart store in 1963. And John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, promising to do things for women. He extends the Equal Pay Act to women in 63. Um, and he extends the Wages and Hours Acts to retail workers who are overwhelmingly women. And Sam Walton wants no part of it. He divides his stores, which are still relatively small, into different units so they won't be large enough to qualify, and the federal government comes after him and he loses in court in the 70s. But he refuses to pay overtime, and he sees his ability to oppress his hourly workers as the key to reducing labor costs. That's his goal. And he says it. He says, we're going to be successful. We're going to be a great store. We have great loyalty, but we're
Right.
cheap. That's the whole business model. So what he does is his version of rank and union. People he selects to be management trainees. Again, it's a tap on the shoulder, no one else criteria. He says quite publicly um, that he's kind of skeptical about college graduates. They're like women. They won't unload trucks or mop floors or do whatever it takes. But what's whatever it takes?
Mm.
The formula, again, high stakes bonus system, something like 2/3 of total salary can come from the bonus. The bonus is tied to total sales divided by labor costs and only labor costs. Walmart's success, touted in the business literature as control of the supply chain, which it micromanages from corporate headquarters, dictating things like the temperature in warehouses, but it delegates personnel matters and only personnel matters to the local employees. And
Right.
it moves them around every couple of years. And what's the point of all of this? It's we don't want store managers who will be loyal to their employees. Walmart at one point had 77% turnover in a single year, and corporate headquarters didn't care. It wants cheap employees.
Right.
And the if the store managers are top performing managers, then they get moved to another store, maybe 300 or 400 miles away on short notice to implement the same methods there. If they're successful, no questions asked. If they are in the bottom group, they're audited. And if they're committing wage theft, they're fired. But, and 10% of store managers tend to be fired or demoted
And
every
when you say
year.
wage theft, what exactly do you mean by that?
Wages and hours violations. So by wage theft, and the whole Walmart literature says this, there's no real way for a store manager to be successful in Walmart's system without committing wages and hours violations. Walmart has a national policy of never paying overtime, chronically short staffing its stores,
Right.
squeezing employees so they quit on short notice often. The store manager has to fill in. The best way to do it is if you're popular with your employees, they clock in, clock out. And on the books, it doesn't show up in a way that entitles them to overtime. But many store managers simply don't pay employees for the hours they worked.
Right.
That's
So
wage
like
theft.
somebody punches out and they say, hey, we have that last box of books that needs to be put in the shelves. Can you just do that before you leave? And then that hour passes and that
Yeah.
happens a zillion times over. And that adds up being like this big chunk of money. And so, okay.
So think of this, because this is actually the same system Jack Welch uses. I mean, he'd be turning over in his grave at the comparison with Sam Walton, but it's the same system. It's as long as you hit your numbers, we don't ask any questions. Indeed, we move you. And GE also moved executives every couple of years to cities, often far away, to new divisions they knew nothing about. You move constantly. Why? So you don't go native. What upper management wants is numbers. Jack Welch loved to brag. He would reach down into the ranks and pick somebody with promise, drive, confidence, and then let them do whatever they want, so long as they meet their numbers. For Sam Walton, the numbers are tied to labor suppression. And again, not a whole lot of questions asked by upper management about how you meet your numbers.
Right.
Walmart is number one in the country in wage theft. That is, documented wages and hours violations that have resulted in fines. But it's also the biggest employer in the country. My guess is the amount of wage theft that has never been documented or punished by the Department of Labor is enormous. And I can tell you about the manipulation of the political system to accomplish that result.
So, so there's fines and what have you that have been, so I'm guessing that wage theft isn't something in criminal code.
It could be, but again, the combination of plausible deniability, you have a bonus system. And let me emphasize, Sam Walton, like the folks on Wall Street,
Mhm.
his motto is beat yesterday. That means you have to do better every year. And you're being graded. In effect, the bonus system grades you in how well you're doing, and some of it is how well you're doing compared to other stores.
Right.
So the pressure is always on to hit those numbers.
Right.
And when Walmart finds out about wage theft, which it does because it audits the low performing store managers who also commit wage theft, it can go to the Department of Labor and say, see, when we find out about it and we look, we do something about it. And they do.
Right. But your high performing stores that are also performing wage theft never get reported. And so they're once again incentivized to keep doing what they're doing, kind of pushing that threshold of ethics and legality ever further and further, away.
Right. We found this story, by the way, in every chapter in the book.
Mhm.
Uber. What was Uber's business model? It was move into a new territory, grow incredibly fast, ignore the laws that regulate taxi companies. And then, when you have the public hearing about whether or not to allow Uber to continue to drive customers to the airport, with the taxi companies objecting, you get your loyal customer base to show up and complain, and the public authorities fold. Now, they do that again by ignoring the laws that apply to taxi companies, claiming they're not a taxi company, even if they meet the definitions. But the key is growing fast. Mark Zuckerberg talks about it as move fast and break things. But
Right.
that growth, where you ignore all the guardrails, and then you have incentives that reward the people who implement it. no matter whether they comply with the law or not. But if they do get in trouble, you fire them.
Right. So, I mean, maybe this channel's called Corruption Inc. And so in the realm of like kind of dealing with corruption, it's like maybe it's kind of a variation instead of like necessarily following the money, it can also be follow the incentive structure,
Yeah, yeah.
and see who's like basically implementing that incentive structure. You keep following that up, you're eventually going to find that proverbial rotten head of the fish, as they say. So the book Fair Shake describes women as being the canary in the coal mine, as far as like all these different workplaces are concerned, and as far as like how corporate culture and what have you is basically institutionalized, throughout the country. And I find that interesting because the book initially comes out as being like very much, um, you know, the impression that it's about women in the
It is about
workplace,
women.
which it is very much so. But it's also about the fact that the issues that women are at the forefront of, of having to deal with are the issues that are going to take everybody down, whether you're a woman or not, and indicative of this toxic culture in corporate America. And I think all the different stories that you have are basically the different parts of it. Like I think you call it the triple bind, right? And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, about how all these different stories are basically showing how as our corporate culture, becomes more and more toxic, that the first victims, so to speak, are the most vulnerable workers, which are often women, minorities, what have you. But that's something that inevitably continues up that food chain.
I mean, let me summarize what happens and then how women are disproportionately affected. And I want to emphasize men are the big winners, but they're also the big losers in the system. So if you think of blue collar men and the automation and manufacturing jobs, the system supercharges them. And so the thing about women is they stay on the inside of the system. They're not outside of the system. But here's my summary of what takes place. So the first move is power becomes personalized. In the old days, and again, think of large corporations of the 50s, the post-war era, power is institutionalized. You're often hiring the next in line, the person who works their way up through the ranks. Modern corporations today are more likely to hire from outside. And, Jack Welch and Sam Walton both prided themselves on not picking the obvious next candidate, but reaching down into the ranks for the person who had the qualities they wanted. So you get rid of the predictability. Women do quite well. I mean, in fact, women do better working their way up within a company than they do switching jobs. Switching jobs is a particular art. Second thing, uh, it is you're pitting people against each other. So this is an atmosphere of distrust. Prove that you are loyal to me. That's going to increase hours, and it's going to mindlessly increase hours. It's not how productive you are. It's your dedication to the job. So that's going to disadvantage anybody who cares about their children. The third thing it does is increase distrust. So we talked about rank and yank. You put employees against each other. It's competitive, high stakes bonus system. Well, in that system where everybody's looking over their shoulder at what the other folks doing, you want people you can trust. And here's the key. There's a rich literature on this. Uh, Managers want employees, especially lieutenants, the people they're grooming for promotion, where they will do things without being asked to do them. And managers want employees where they can predict how their underlings will respond to pressure. Okay? Michael Cohen describes this beautifully when he talks about working for Donald Trump, that Donald never says do X, but he clearly indicates he wants X done, and then he looks to see who does it for him, and those are the people he promotes or pays more better or whatever he does. And
Well, that's the plausible deniability part too,
yeah.
because if somebody does something illegal, he can say, "Well, I never told him to do that."
So here's the thing. Yeah, there's again, rich literature. Uh, Male bosses aren't so good at reading women, predicting their behavior, understanding, when the scowl means that they disapprove versus when it's simply they're confused. And if you can't read your underlings so well, then it's very hard to do the hint, hint, nod, nod kind of instruction. I'll give you a story that I kind of summarizes for me. One of the people we interviewed told us the story of, she had a particular job, and there's a new boss who comes in, and she's meeting him for the first time. And he tells her the story of how the assistant booked him into a hotel with mirrored ceilings and the effect this has on his libido. And she's wondering, what is she supposed to do with the story? She doesn't think he's hitting on her, but she can't think of any good way to respond, so she says nothing. And she said, I have no idea what that was about. And I tell the story to Bill, and Bill said, and to a number of male colleagues, and they say to me, well, a guy telling the story to another guy can tell a whole lot from the reaction. You can tell whether your employee is a goody two-shoes, whether they're embarrassed, whether they're a player, whether they respond by escalating even more ribald remarks. But with a woman, there's no good way to respond. I mean, if you engage, it's like a come on. If you called about, like, if you're ready to go to the sexual harassment office, your career with this guy's over. But there's no real good way to respond. And I think that is even if, in this particular,
Very soft and nuanced way of
yeah,
like power getting what it wants.
yeah,
Yeah, very, very, yeah, yeah, I mean, because plausible deniability, once again, because if she if she sees the opportunity and takes it, well, she's given consent, right? If she doesn't, then obviously, well, I never, that's not what I meant at all ever anyway, and so
yeah.
yeah,
So
it's a fishing expedition.
right. And you want to know, how to play people, how to motivate them. Without crossing the line of saying, oh, I need to make sure we don't pay overtime. I mean, again, Walmart announces this, but that for the person who has worked hours that qualifies for overtime, where federal law mandates paying overtime, I want to make sure you are the kind of person who won't pay. You don't want bosses saying that directly. You
Right.
want to know who's going to respond to the right incentives.
It's an interesting variation on the idea of trust
Yeah,
within a company, right? It's like
trust
you're
among
you're not
thieves.
looking for trustworthiness. You're looking for trust that somebody's going to be loyal to your dictates.
Yeah. So,
So
well, that's what we found. And now add another piece to this. So if you take Trump, you take Elon Musk, you take Jack Welch, all these folks are walking caricatures of narcissism. Certainly with Trump and Musk, malignant narcissism, as George Conway likes to describe, a psychological diagnosis. But they're clearly narcissists. And, there's a lot of discussion in the corporate literature now of the psychopath in the corner office, Machiavellianism, the willingness to use people, it's amorality. I mean,
right.
these traits are rampant. And so when you start thinking about that, this is the second leg of the double bind that we described for women, which is okay, you have women who will break the rules, but they're less likely to get away with it. Let's take narcissism. It turns out, there are these controlled studies. If you ask employees, does your boss have the following characteristics? And some of those characteristics are associated with narcissism. They like to be the center of attention. They are drawn to power, positions of power and authority. They feel justified in running roughshod over others to accomplish what is necessary. These are all traits associated with narcissism. And so they ask employees to rate their bosses, by asking them indirect questions. Well, it turns out that when employees rate their male bosses as narcissistic, they're also inclined to rate them more highly. When they rate their female bosses as narcissistic, they rate them as less effective as being a boss.
And is that across both male and female employees?
Yes.
Hmm.
And so what you get is something where the women, this is the second leg of the triple bind,
Right, right.
is women who employ the same tactics don't win. And if there's an investigation, Bill, again, Bill was telling me in savings and loan days that investigators would deliberately pressure the women. Why? You say to the woman, "You're going to go away for jail for 5 years and not see your kid during the key uh,
Right.
areas when the children are young."
Years of their rearing, yeah.
Yeah, the women fold more quickly than the men and rat out the person above them. So again, women are at a disadvantage if they are perceived as being more honest. But if they are perceived as being dishonest, uh, people are more likely not to like them. And
Right.
then they're the first person the investigators go after for a variety of reasons, including the fact other employees will rat them out. And so their vulnerability, if there's an investigation, if the women are going to attract attention and pressure before a male employee, or if they're more likely to rat out the person above them, or if they're perceived as more likely to rat out the person above them, even if it's not true, then you don't want that person as your lieutenant. Again,
Right.
yeah, so and the third leg of the triple bind, you do things like you introduce these high stakes pay that pits people against each other. Um, there is a dramatic decline in the number of people who will apply, but
Hmm.
gender differences in applications increase by at least 50%. Women don't apply for jobs like that to the
Right.
same degree men do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like once again going back to our trainer, that we spoke to in the con. It's like that they were almost always, young men that were
Mhm.
coming in, and if there were women, that they generally speaking very quickly fell off. And and when you have
Yeah.
like this group of young men who are incentivized by these things, the culture becomes, I mean, it just really condenses,
Yeah.
really quickly. And so I could see it being even more difficult for a woman to be able to come into that atmosphere once this has already been going for a little while.
And these kinds of atmospheres breed sexual harassment and bullying.
Right. So I think that maybe one of the important takeaways is that when you see these things high, sexual harassment, occurring, like bad retention based off of sex or gender or that type of thing, that those are things that would be like, you know, interesting to an untrained eye. But if you are doing like an analysis of, well, what's this company like, that those are indicative of shops that are being run by this very toxic corporate culture. And I think that that is ultimately what, from my perspective, what you mean by women are the canary in the coal mine. That if you see this happening with women in a company, you know what's happening up top.
So, if you see a lack of diversity in the modern era, where diversity is valued, something's wrong with the company.
Ooh.
And it's not,
You
okay,
say that in an era where DEI is being openly
yeah.
attacked. It's a very it's quite it's quite an interesting analysis that creates. So
Well,
sorry, go
the
ahead.
Trump administration is the poster child for this. They don't believe in DEI, they believe in crony capitalism. Let's hire Donald Trump's friends who will do what he wants, who will cash in on the grift. And there's no pretense. His
Yeah.
administration are the best and the brightest.
So no, this is good. I'm glad that we're getting here because one of the things that you bring up in the later parts of the book is how when you have this in the corporate, systems throughout the country, then the political system, was matching
Yeah.
this at the same time. And so I think that that's basically what you just described. I'm sure that, obviously history doesn't begin with Trump,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, it's like he's created uh, let's just say unique administration, that things are much more easily distilled, by looking at it, as opposed to something where maybe the same things happen with a little more lilt, as the case might be. Now this, when we're talking about government and how this sort of corporate culture, when translated into government, becomes cronyism. And then, of course, that feeds right back into, it becomes a feedback loop between government and corporations and what have you. Obviously, if it's toxic in a corporate environment, then it'd be toxic in a government environment. And so maybe you can explain to the audience, exactly like how we should translate what we're seeing with a lot of the stuff that, like, say, Doge is involved with, as being an extension of this corporate culture, now being the ethos of the government.
Well, first, you've got this whole mindset coming out of Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is, again, I mean, if Jack Welch did this for corporate America writ large, Silicon Valley, it does it on steroids. I mean, the whole business model of startup culture is, I mean, when you say who do they fund? They fund people with Elon Musk style personality. The kind of people who are absolutely driven, who have no personal life. They're obsessed with their companies, who will drive through brick walls. That was Mark Cuban's, the entrepreneur's
Right.
comment about Travis Kalanick. Is the good news about Travis is he will drive through a brick wall to accomplish what his goals are. The bad news about Travis is he will drive through a brick wall, but that means ignoring the law. The focus is on short-term reductionist metrics. So you say, how did Elon Musk become the richest man in the world? He beat production estimates at Tesla, and he did it by ignoring quality control on Teslas. So, part of the story with which we open the book is a young woman who ends up getting fired. And not only did she experience large-scale sexual harassment, but she points out quality defects, in a problem with the Teslas and a fix. She's got a fix for it. And it's not that expensive or that time consuming. And they ignore her because the only thing that matters is beating the production estimates. And the point where the share price of Tesla explodes is when he beats production estimates. And in the same 2 week period, he has something like 500,000 Teslas recalled because of product quality defects. The market doesn't care. So that it is share price, not earnings, share price or profits, that it is the production, beating production estimates that drove the price of Teslas through the ceiling, making Musk incredibly wealthy. And his goal, again, was to flood the EV market, to produce a relatively low cost but trendy EV, electric
Mhm.
vehicle. Um, Again, to supercharge the market. And he did it by ignoring quality controls. And he admits it. There was an article talking about how they reversed engineers Teslas and they had the quality of a Kia, and or maybe worse. And Musk admitted it. He said, "Oh, don't buy the first production run. By the second and third, we'll have figured out the problems and corrected them." And he admits it. So now take this to what he's doing with Doge. Again, he buys the Kool-Aid The Kool-Aid is we don't need government. I mean, private companies can do it so much more efficiently. And we certainly don't need employees with job security who stay for the long term. That's the deep state. That's people who will say no. Um, and so
Right.
our goal is to get rid of them, to slash the federal government by simply willy-nilly getting rid of people. He does this. He did this at SpaceX, is you fire lots of people. And then what you find out is what causes the rockets to blow up. Okay. And the rockets blow up, and then you figure out you need more of a certain kind of engineer, and you uh, cut too deeply. That's where you're going to fill in. But in the meantime, you've slashed costs, stock market reward slashing costs. Slashing costs is good. Rockets blowing up, must use that as cost of doing business. There are not people on the rockets that are blowing up at the moment, but he's doing the same thing with driverless cars. Um,
Right.
and Teslas have had things happen like the trunk that flies open while you're driving on the highway. Um, and so, you slash costs, you see what goes wrong, you fix what goes wrong, but in the meantime, the stock market is rewarding the slashing of costs, which increases quarterly earnings. That's the mindset. So the way you take charge, and at Twitter, he fired 80% of the employees, 65% were women. He in particular got rid of the top women of the company who tended to be the ones in charge of things like getting rid of anti-Semitism or racism or Nazism on Twitter.
Terrible stuff like that.
Yeah. And and so then you put in your own people. You have a climate of fear, but a climate of ambition. And so it creates lots of opportunities, and you put in your own people and you gain control. And that's what this is about at Doge, is you slash, then you rebuild. I mean, Marco Rubio claims to want to rebuild some of foreign aid within the State Department, as opposed to AID, which has some degree of independence. But you're constantly pruning. No employee is safe.
Right.
No employee has a job guarantee, which is, of course, what the federal government does. It pays less than comparable private sector jobs, but there's more job security in the civil service system. He ignores it. I mean, most of what he's doing is illegal. He just
Right.
ignores them. And it's a
So,
fait accompli. You can't replace overnight the employees who are being fired. The federal government has expertise that doesn't exist anywhere else. And it has lots of people who are specialists in arcane areas where there's no private sector counterpart. So if those people are gone, the expertise is gone from the federal government.
right. Right. So, I mean, this to me is like a classic example of people needing to understand that the government is not a business. It's a service provider, if anything.
Mhm.
It is not a business, and so it definitely shouldn't be run like a business, even like one that would be universally thought of as a well-run business, much less something that's based off of what we're currently seeing today. Now, what is also interesting is that in the con, like a lot of the corruption that we spoke about in that was about how political appointees in the government uh, basically decided where they're going to point their people. So for instance, if somebody's involved with banking in some sort of regard, you're a political appointee. The boss says we're not trying to prosecute the banks. We want to prosecute the people who are whatever, and so they point it towards that, and that becomes a thing. So, but nevertheless, the bureaucracy, the people who work, nonpartisan people, non-political appointees who work there, uh, were just there to do their jobs. And so if that political appointee, decided to turn the other way, then that's where they would go. Now what feels different now with what Doge is doing is that it's not just the political appointee. They're trying to some variation of rank and yank the entire federal bureaucracy with their types of people. And if that are incentivized by the absolute worst things, that incentive structure, basically, does in the corporate sector. I mean, it's really kind of scary to think of what the possibilities are in government.
Yes. And so I mean, I'm going to start little and get big. So let's start little. What do executives like Jack Welch and others do? When we interviewed people for a book, the stories came up over and over again. I talked to my hairdresser. She told the story of her significant other who's a machinist in Kansas City. And the company gets acquired by somebody else, and there are a new group of executives who come in who head the division. What's the first thing they do? Well, the training program at this company was the best in Kansas City. The machinists in this company had the best reputation in Kansas City. What's the first thing the suits, as they're called, do? They get rid of the training program. The cost savings are immediate. There's no immediate decline in quality because you have well-trained people, but 2, 3 years down the road, the quality of the services provided will be less. But the suits don't care because they'll be gone. The executive who comes in who's head of this division, if they succeed in cutting costs, they're moved to the next division where they will cut costs. The consequences will not be borne by them. And the company, again, if share prices increase, the executives are all getting their bonuses. And then they will do something else to goose the share price 2, 3 years down the road when the quality has suffered. What did Jack Welch do at GE? He got rid of I mean, GE used to be, in fact, Jack Welch got a start in their plastics lab. Think of, uh, plastics, Dustin
Right.
Hoffman.
The graduate. Yeah.
Right. GE had some of the best plastic labs in the world. They got rid of those. I mean, the basic research that doesn't pay off in 6 months. And I talked to somebody in Silicon Valley who said, yeah, the suits came in. What did they do? They wanted to know how long it would take for our research lab to pay off. And the answer was 3 to 5 years down the road. And they said, it goes. Anything that doesn't pay off within 6 months. Now do that to the federal government. Again, the federal government funds basic research. The whole divide between, private companies are happy to undertake the kind of research that pays off in 6 months. They're happy to take the results that come out of government and university research labs and apply it. What they don't do is the basic research that has no guarantee of paying off in a short time period. That's what Musk is cutting. Okay. And he is doing the same thing that these executives did to private industry. But when you do it to the government, only the government funds basic research. So it's like destroying the seed corn for the next generation of innovation.
Yeah. So it's
Okay.
kind of an interesting metaphor, given that the story of like the seed vault being being destroyed.
So that's and then the other piece, and again, so one of the things about going back to Sam Walton, I wanted to name the chapter "The Once and Future of Sexism," because Walton is emerging in the 40s and 50s. This is where he gets his ideas from, and he discovers women as this great untapped resource. One of the things he does brilliantly is the motivation for his store managers is like everything we're talking about, high stakes bonus system. He wants people who are competitive, amoral, greedy. Okay. But he doesn't think of his hourly employees that way. He thinks of them as good Arkansas farm women who will greet their neighbors, who have very few alternatives in terms of jobs. And if you take Betty Dukes, the story of Betty Dukes is, she was the seventh of 11 children born to a single mother who had moved from Louisiana to Pittsburgh, California, also a failed steel town. She dropped out of high school, 2 failed marriages, a lot of issues with alcohol abuse, minor arrest record. and she hits rock bottom. And when she does, she finds God. And when she finds God, she becomes an ordained Baptist minister. And she needs a job, and Walmart opens up down the street, and she goes to work for Walmart. And she thinks she's found her place. Walmart prides itself on its Christian values. And this is overtly Christian. I don't mean following Jesus. I mean being a Christian company.
Right.
And she feels comfortable and she thinks they mean it. And she very quickly goes from part-time to full-time, from full-time to a customer service manager, the highest point she can have without going into management training, still paid by the hour. And she thinks I'm perfect for them. I share their values. They share my values. We have together deep roots in the community. We have a service ethic, ethos. And Walmart stressed that. Sam Walton stressed that, emphasizing for hourly employees, but not store managers, a sense of identification with the company that had a certain esprit de corps and community and gimmicks. They had
Right.
Walmart TV and they broadcasted to all the stores that increase the identification and get people who feel good about their jobs to accept less pay. But the federal government does that too, in a different, less cynical way. When I was at the Justice Department, we got paid a lot less than the attorneys in private practice. But working for the government hours, and we were not billing by the hour. So if you got your work done, it didn't matter how many hours it took you to do it. You could go home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock.
Right.
But if the brief was due that day, you were there till 11 or 12. Um, and um, and so, but what you had is a great deal of responsibility at a young age and a sense of satisfaction. I mean, this is not about making money or working for companies who are breaking the rules. For the most part, we had some ability to say no to our clients, the different federal agencies, if they were doing the wrong thing or advancing ludicrous legal arguments in that era. And so what you get with the federal government are people who do accept less money because they believe in the job. And there's a measure of job security that used to be pervasive in corporate America too, but is gone in corporate America and is not gone in the government. And so being a government employee at a higher level is a lot like being in the university. You get paid less than the private sector. You have a more secure job. But the more important thing is you have a sense of job satisfaction. And Doge ignores that. I mean, utterly ignores that the motivation
Oh, it
that,
hates that, it feels like.
yes, yeah,
Like it's
no,
trying to gut that completely out.
well, they are because it's the deep state. When they refer to the deep state, they mean people who will tell Donald Trump, I won't do that because it's illegal. I won't do that because it's stupid and counterproductive. I won't do that because it's unethical. They don't want that. And so when you look at the degradation of government, and this has been the plan since Reagan, it's starve the beast. And
Right.
that's what Musk is doing. Again, cut the
That's a
employees.
Grover Norquist quote, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Starve the
I
beast.
think it is. Well, and again, we have all this data on how the tax cuts, the tax cut mania associated with Grover Norquist
Right.
leads to all kinds of bad things, the decimation of public schools, etc. But if you starve the beast, if you and Ted Cruz has done this to the IRS, the goal, successive waves of Republican Congresses have done this to the post office, and that's a more complex story. But if you don't give the IRS enough money, what does it do? Well, it can only launch a couple of major tax investigations a year. I mean, if you want to audit Donald Trump, the resources it takes to audit Donald Trump means you can't audit 10 other billionaires who are cheating. And
Right.
so you've effectively, so if we want to talk about fraud, and let me give you one more story. So, what are they doing with Social Security? Again, they're acting like a business. We have Luigi Mangione, who assassinated the head of United Healthcare, and
Allegedly.
You Googled United Healthcare and asked why might he have picked United Healthcare? It's number one in the country in claims denials. How do you make money as an insurance company? You just deny claims willy-nilly, valid claims, and then see who is willing to appeal. The people who persist, who appeal, maybe 2 or 3 levels of appeal, and have valid claims get paid. But most people who have their claims denied will give up.
Right.
You saved a whole lot of money by denying valid claims. United Healthcare is number one in the country at 30%. Also, if you Google them, you will discover that the Wall Street Journal did a major investigation of billing fraud involving Medicare. Again, this is focused specifically on United Healthcare. I think the government has just reported that they've not going to, proceed with any sanctions against them. I'm not up on what happened in the last 2 days.
Right. And this was Medicare Part C in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you talk about fraud involving the federal government, okay, there is almost no fraud involving individual claimants. And the IRS and Social Security compared to a private insurance company is dramatically more efficient at paying money. You take money from one pot, put it in another pot. The federal government is very good at that because it's not playing games. There's no incentive to cheat people. There's no incentive to take the money and invest it in risky propositions. The federal government
Right.
doesn't
Because
do
it's
that.
not a business.
Right. Private companies do that. Federal government doesn't do that. So when you're talking about fraud and various government insurance things like Medicare, it is private companies. Again, with the Wall Street Journal suggesting that United Healthcare is doing that, but I'll leave that to the Wall Street Journal. There's no question there is pervasive, extensive Medicare fraud that runs into maybe the hundreds of billions. That's fraud against the government. The big entities doing it, not private individuals. The overbilling comes from doctors and hospitals associations. What is the first thing the Trump administration did? Fire the Inspector General of HHS, who oversees the fraud investigations. Ted Cruz did this to the IRS 15 years ago. You know that the federal investigators who in charge of policing financial fraud were taken off, the cops were taken off the beat back during the, actually during the Clinton years, but accelerating during the Bush years. If you slash the regulators, then you can't fight the fraud that Elon Musk is supposedly trying to counter. And that's exactly what he's done. And that tells you he's not trying to prevent fraud. He's trying to incentivize it. And why do you incentivize it? Well, there are 2 reasons. Your cronies get rich. I mean, he's fraudulent. He is a big recipient of government largesse. Or you try to show the government is incompetent so you can privatize it. That's what they've done to the post office. I mean, the big thing they've done to the post office is to prevent the post office from doing things that would make more money for the post office where it might compete and undercut campaign contributors for the politicians. The post office, to the extent it has a problem with money, has a problem bringing enough revenue because it's handcuffed by the politicians. And they want to get rid of it. They've proposed getting rid of it. This has been, the goal is to get rid of the parts of government that works. Social Security is the most successful system of old age insurance in the country. It's better than private pensions in terms of running efficiently and competently with a minimum of administrative costs. It does so, I mean, if you compare government insurance to other insurance companies, government has dramatically fewer administrators and administrative expenses. Now, that's good. But if you undercut the people who police fraud, then you encourage grift. And the people, again, I want to emphasize, the people causing government huge amounts of losses are not some individual claiming Medicaid who doesn't qualify. It is the hospital associations and doctors who are overbilled.
Right, right. Oh yeah, yeah. Because I mean, that's why I was like pointing out that it was. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's primarily Medicare Part C where we're seeing that because that's the one where you're engaged with the private
Yes,
insurance and medical providers and stuff like that, as
right.
opposed to regular Medicare, which is a straight single payer situation. Now, the
Right.
other
So,
thing
yeah,
that's
the
interesting.
United Healthcare, it's the Medicaid, Medicare Advantage program
Right.
where the Wall Street Journal did this major investigation.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then that also brings up like the terrifying prospect of all the money being pulled out of Medicaid, and what that's going to mean. And so so basically, it sounds as if a lot of what Doge is doing is to sort of uh, bring in the exact same sort of incentives and way of doing things that United Healthcare per se, does in order to run their business, in order to run our Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security system.
Yeah, and again, I want to emphasize this is simply creating administrative roadblocks to getting money to which you're entitled. This is not rooting out fraud. I mean, when who was it? Secretary of the Treasury, Howard I'm blanking his last name, is saying, hey, when you cut off checks, it's the fraudsters who squeal the loudest. My mother-in-law is not going to my mother-in-law with a billionaire son-in-law is not the one who's going to go complain. Well, yeah, the people in the early stages of dementia who are in wheelchairs or nursing homes aren't going to get themselves down to the Social Security office. That's true. But they're entitled to these benefits and they're dependent on them. And you want to create roadblocks to people who are entitled to benefits getting them. I mean, when Bill applied for Social Security and there were, I don't know, there's some kind of snafu, we had a Social Security worker call him on the phone at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning and spend an hour with him, making sure that all the paperwork got done so he could get his benefits. That's an extraordinary level of service. That's what they're cutting.
Right, right. All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, and I really thank you for joining us here today. Once again, we are with June Carbone, who is the professor of law at the University of Minnesota and co-writer in this fine book. And I encourage everybody to go and pick one up and read it. It's a treasure trove of great information and anecdotes that really sort of well, I can't say it illustrates a great vision, but it helps. It certainly is helpful in being able to understand, what we're seeing in our everyday lives and economy. So once again, thank you so much, June. Really appreciate you coming on, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Well, thank you. This is great. Enjoyed it.
So, what did we learn from our conversation with June? Um, Once again, it's a situation where it's terrifying out there, right? Because the things that are out there that are meant to protect us from the predatory nature of the corrupt is the federal government and the regulatory system that was put in place, and these different departments and these different programs that were supposed to be there in order to be a bulwark between the masses and the complete exploitation of those masses from powerful corporate entities, and in many cases, government entities, as the case is growing into to a large degree right now. We have to do better in picking the people who are going to Washington for us. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I am going to say that it's becoming increasingly more difficult with things like Citizens United and just the blank check that large, powerful entities have in being able to buy our elected officials. Makes it a daunting task to try to get a government that is going to actually do well by us. But nevertheless, we have to demand it. And quite often that means going out in the streets. And I think recently we've seen a lot of that. And over the years, whether it's been something that's been more coming from the right or from the left, we have seen that. And in every case, there's always legitimate gripes to be had. So if you're on the left and you were looking at some of the things that were happening on a lot of the demonstrations that were coming from the right, you remove all the racism, you remove like all the problematic aspects, and look at what some of the economic issues that they were talking about. They're there and they're real. And if you're on the right looking at the left, once again, whatever issues that are not necessarily your cup of tea, there is a common ground where we know that the system isn't working for any of us on the bottom. And so demanding a better politics is just the beginning. I mean, when I think about where we are today and whom our government is representing, who it represents today isn't necessarily any different than who it represented in the last administration, or two administrations before that. Because of the structures that have been developed over the last several administrations, decades, it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you are beholden to more powerful moneyed interests than the people. So how do we root that out? I don't know. That might be a question for another episode. But it is important to understand that before it got to the government, it started in the private sector. And we can demand better in the different companies that we work for, in any place of work that we happen to be. We can demand that those workplaces be equitable, that those workplaces do not discriminate, that those workplaces do not create environments where people feel endangered. We can have a much stronger sway as the workers within our society if we are braver about demanding the bare minimum. And if we do that, then maybe it will embolden us to demand stuff like a living wage, to demand things like just creating a society where nobody's left behind, where it's not always inuring itself to the most wealthiest among us. I can't remember who said it, but it was once said that way that you judge a society is by how it treats the poorest amongst them. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think that something that we can learn from the conversation that we just had is that we need to demand better, more equitable, safer workspaces. We need to demand that we get paid what we're worth. If there's one thing that we learned from this conversation that we had with June, is that in order to have a just society, we have to have a just workplace. And even if like changing the entire government seems like too big of a job for us, maybe we start someplace close to home. Let's make sure that where we work is just and equitable and fair. If we do that, I think it goes a long way in helping change the dynamic and changing things far above, the simple environs of the different places that we work on a day-to-day basis. We change the workplace, maybe we do change society. Anyway, thanks again for stopping by, and please like, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell everybody if you value this content. Do us a solid and push all those buttons and hit all those keys, and make sure that you let both us and the algorithm know that you value us. Anyway, be well. We'll see you next week.
Hey all, become that person nobody dares to argue with. Hit like, subscribe, and that little bell button for notifications. Talk to you soon.